this presentation will be predicated on, return on the investment, the options that are out there primarily for loblolly pine. But a big part of our program is also we grow 8 million hardwoods every year. This is a landowner from a property that Paul Jeffries, our reforestation advisor in Mississippi and North Alabama, visited in Kemper County, Mississippi, that had planted a mix of oak species in a bottomland whose objectives were for growing hardwood saw logs, but also for enhanced wildlife habitat. But as I mentioned, I'll be speaking mostly about loblolly pine objectives. And, one of the things that we're very cognizant of, and probably a lot of you are as well, is that, we're planting roughly, 1 billion seedlings every year in the Southern United States. And there's one of those situations where we've been doing it for so long. As a matter of fact, I just gave a presentation to the Forestry Association in South Carolina for their annual meeting. And in doing some research, I had noticed that the first nursery was actually started in 1922 in Bogalusa, Louisiana. So we've been at this for about 100 years in the Southern United States. And it's one of those things that it is a success story, a huge success story, what we've done. And we've come so far. But one of the things, and it's a success if somebody plants back, and it's a big deal just to plant back. But there is a lot of truth to the fact that a lot of acres are actually planted just going through the motion. And when you ask a lot of landowners and say, well, what did you plant? Well, we planted, pine seedlings. I think it was loblolly pine, but they may not know what the genetics were. They just know that it got planted. And that's part of what I'm talking about with going through the motions and not necessarily knowing what's going out there. Certainly a big part of what's available is, open pollinated seedlings, and, where we know the mother, but we don't know the father. This is a picture in the left panel of an open pollinated seed orchard, where we know the genetic gain of the mother, but we don't know what the outside influence is from the pollen, and pollen can fly for hundreds of miles. And so it's good that we know what the genetic base of the mother is, but we just have no influence. And so the genetic gain is brought down because we don't know the father, versus MCP forestry, where we have the ability to isolate the flower on the orchard tree and pollinate it with pollen from a known father. And loblolly pine is monoecious, so it actually has male and female flowers. And so what we're doing is we're selecting the good mother trees and using the pollen from really high genetic gain elite father from parents as well. I think most everybody knows what this would look like, but it's a bare root seedling, and it's a situation where this is still the predominant stock type that is used, planted from the window between December and the end of February. And this is, still predominantly, like I said, it's over 80% of what is planted nowadays. And even though container seedlings has increased, still the predominant stock type is bare root. And these can be used, for hand planting and machine planting. But the biggest thing is to get, finished planting, or to keep it in that window between December and the end of February for the best survival. Certainly, and here's a photo of container seedlings. They have gained a lot of popularity in recent years. Containers were actually first popularized in Canada, and people began to hear stories about container seedlings being used in British Columbia from some of the timber companies up in the Pacific Northwest. and they actually began to find their way to the southeastern United States. And, you know, the biggest thing to remember is the interesting thing is the genetics are exactly the same that I just showed you as a bare root and then as a container seedling. It's just the stock type, the way that it's, you know, the growing platform, the way it's delivered to the forest landowner. And so, but the biggest advantage is with containers is if you can plant them early. Planting bare root or container seedlings in that normal planting window of December to the end of February doesn't yield any differences in growth. There's a lot of studies, a lot of literature that back this up, but the biggest advantages for a container seedling over a bare root is if you can get out there, or you can get out there and plant in October if you've gotten your site prep done early, if you've got labor that's in place and can get it done. That's the biggest advantage because the seedling can begin to grow. The other advantage that containers can have is if you're forced to plant late, like in March, or some people that even have to go into April. It just gives you added insurance on survival. And so the biggest, you know, thing to remember though is nothing really magical happens with a container. I think there is a big misconception in the marketplace. I think sometimes that if you plant containers, it's going to magically give you better growth if you're planting them at the same time as bare root. While containers do have big advantages that I listed just a few minutes ago, it doesn't change the growth potential of the tree if they're planted at the same time. It also, you know, doesn't change the, you know, the survival if you've done really good, if you've really done good site prep and if it's on a regular site. Now, sometimes you can get into certain sites that are tough where they have rocky or gravelly soil. They're really just tough sites maybe to get planted, and certainly you can get a distinct survival advantage there on rough sites. But planted within the normal window, just remember that certainly it's not going to change the genetics of the tree. And as a matter of fact, you know, when I show this slide that says things don't always go as planned, I actually took this picture. We always say that, you know, green side up is pretty basic, but I took this picture in North Carolina on a machine planting job, and I said, I've got to get a picture of this. This is unbelievable. There was a tree that had actually been planted upside down. So, you know, the moral of this slide or the story is that things don't always go as planned. And I've got an example to kind of elaborate on that. And that is, you know, a landowner in this case that had planted used containers. You know, we say don't confuse survival with success. Certainly there's like I mentioned, there's several good reasons to plant containers, but don't think that, as I said, something magical is going to happen with the genetics. This particular landowner got 95% survival or greater, but the stand is pure pulpwood. And if you're in a market, which is most of the South, that is predominantly based on good saw timber markets, you could be in trouble. So just because you see green trees in the first 2 or 3 years, it doesn't mean that it changes the genetics of the stand. And, you know, from that standpoint, fortunately, you have options. I know that when I started my career and I was doing summer jobs, actually cruising timber, mid-rotation age stands, specifically, I would inventory those stands that were just getting ready to be thinned, like this one. And so this was back in the early 90s when I was doing a lot of this work. And, you know, every few trees that you tallied had, like in this picture, they were crooked trees, there were some low forks, and fusiform rust has always been very prevalent in our southern forest, unfortunately. And this was just kind of commonplace because if you think about it, those stands that I was doing the inventory work on, they had probably been established in the late 70s or during the 80s, early 80s. And so they were using, you know, first generation, second generation type, you know, open pollinated, low end open pollinated genetics. And so this was just kind of common standard, but it's changed drastically now. I'll show you this, and I'll show this picture a little bit later. also to kind of give you, to kind of juxtapose it with the before and after thin. But this is a stand that, in central South Carolina, a photo I took right before it was thinned, that was planted in the 2000s with MCP, our control pollinated seedlings, where it's just, as you can see, it's vastly different. And it's like I was talking to a forester in central Mississippi not too long ago, where he was telling me about having tough times getting rid of pulpwood. And he said, stands like this, like the one I'm showing you in the right panel, are built for success. If they have built-in, factors for success, because if pulpwood markets all of a sudden get really good, then you've got more tons. But certainly for solid wood potential, you're in a lot better shape to be able to grow chip and saw and saw timber. And what we do and what we've done, actually, it mirrors the agricultural. We're agribusiness. We're a part of agriculture, obviously, but we've always lagged behind big improvements in agriculture, and that's because it takes a long time to breed and test trees. But you can certainly see that we're analogous to the agricultural industry. I'll show you a picture here of corn, and a cornfield that would, I know Barry Shiver shared this picture. I have to give him credit for this photo. He well-known silviculturist, Dr. Shiver, shared this with us many years ago, that, it shows a picture of probably what a cornfield looked like 80 years ago. And that's drastically changed to modern day, intensive row crop agriculture that looks like this field in the bottom panel. And, every now and then I listen to rural radio, and every single commercial that you listen to is based on a different, soybean or corn or cotton variety, and doing a really good job of competition control, because it's all about yield. I don't know if anybody, follows agricultural or, commodity reports or prices, but it's pretty amazing to think about the fact that corn is, I think, still probably about $2.50 per bushel right now. And it's the same price that it was back in the mid 90s. But the way that the farmers have stayed in business is by increasing yield. Back in the, 150 years ago, and 100 years ago, they were planting open pollinated varieties, but started planting double cross hybrids. And that's the same thing like our MCP trees are. They're just hybrids. And subsequently, we've been able to increase the deployment of MCP seedlings or hybrids, knowing the mother and the father, like I showed you earlier in the orchard. And we're now on the cusp of that upswing in productivity. It's been a lot of fun to be a part of. What does that look like? Well, here's to kind of show you what that does look like on a side-by-side basis. Here's, I talked about a lot of the cruising, the inventory work I did back in the early 90s. And this is exactly what most of the base genetic, like open pollinated trees look like. This is probably, a lot of times one of the better individuals. And because landowners started planting our MCP hybrids in the mid 2000s, I should say, we have examples like this 14-year-old MCP tree. You can see a vast difference in the volume of the stem, really nice form, and much smaller limbs for better wood quality. The smaller the limbs, obviously, the smaller the knot size, for better wood quality. One of the things I want to kind of just lightly touch on as well is the fact that, we mentioned what you don't know can hurt you. And I think it's really important for particularly forest landowners that are joining us today to remember, as I mentioned, a lot of times, well, and let me back up even further and say, if you remember, I said, look, it's just a success if we're planting tracks back. I mean, that's the first step. But, remember that I said a lot of times we're going through the motions. We don't always know what's being planted out there. And I think one of the things to remember is the tree planters do a tremendous service. They are, I mean, we couldn't do all this without the tree planting contractors, obviously, that are out there, that provide both hand planting and machine planting. And they just provide that invaluable service, but they don't have the time to do the genetics research to know what the latest and greatest is in terms of what the options are. I know I know several machine planters like are photoed in this photograph. They spend all off season getting their equipment like these bulldozers and planters ready for the upcoming year. It takes them all spring and summer to get those ready. And they have to work on labor issues. So they don't have the time like we do to discuss, genetic options, what your choices may be. And that's really important to remember, because not only are they working on equipment, but they'll help work on site preparation, aerial site prep, and just mechanical site prep. So their days are really, really full of all those activities. And it takes, I know they work late into the night just to get all these to get their equipment and get labor in line for the upcoming year. So just remember, you're the one that's in control. You design that next forest. And you design that forest so you don't end up in a situation like was our cover slide, which is like this stand that's not reaching its optimum because of problems with disease. Like you see the fusiform rust tree that's always going to be pulpwood in the foreground. And as I transition to this next slide with this poor gentleman that looks disappointed, bless his heart, it does remind me of a story, to relate to you. I was coming down, I'll never forget where I was. I was on Interstate 95 in North Carolina, and a consulting forester actually called me that I've known and been friends with for many years. And he said they were getting ready to thin a plantation that had been established in the early 90s, and that it was almost completely full of fusiform rust, a disease that is the most common disease that hurts us the worst here. And it's predominant in stands where there hasn't been a lot of genetic improvement. And what he was telling me was that it was terrible because they didn't have any options. They went in there to try to thin it, but we're going to end up having to clear cut it. We ran into a similar situation like that in Alabama, where a landowner had planted base open pollinated genetics back in the late 90s and went in there to thin. And when he thinned it, but the basal area, the trees that were remaining, and the density that was left after it had been thinned was so low that he decided ultimately to clear cut it. And when he did, he went back. Here's our reforestation advisor I mentioned earlier, Paul Jeffries. He planted back MCP hybrids, and this is after 2 growing seasons in central Alabama. Just to show you another couple of photos to kind of build on that of success stories are MCP just outside of Sylvania, Georgia. And then, of course, a varietal stand this stand is actually now has finished 13 growing seasons. It's a consulting forester's property just outside of Monticello, Florida, that he's already thinned twice by age 12. He did 2 weed control treatments. It's very intensive, but it's also a really neat place to go and see on about 65 acres in Jefferson County, Florida. I'll share with you now this video of Mr. Charles Stockton in East Texas, who speaks a little bit about engagement with reforestation advisors and working on his goals on his timber, like I said, in East Texas, on his timberland in East Texas.
The main thing they furnish was trees that will grow. And that they have done. The trees that I've bought have grown and grown like crazy. So I'm real pleased with the progress and surprised how fast they grow. My name is Charles Stockton, live in Crockett, Texas. This is my family's legacy land that has been in the family since 1906. The NRCS program here in Crockett, Texas introduced me. They gave me information, and at that time I was looking for a source that was close by and cost effective, and Aberdeen's name kept coming up. I also talked to local planters. They all said the same thing, that you guys were the go-to guys. I'm always the type of person that likes to make an informed decision. I don't like to be told to do this or that or the other. I like to be given the information, let me draw my own conclusions. I like to read about stuff and formulate questions, and then I can call and ask questions, and they'll always hook me up with somebody that knows what's going on. And they're real good about that. They give you their opinion, they get you the information. So that always is a good thing. They're real good about working with you on inventory. Call ahead of time, get your order in, get you placed, coordinate with getting it picked up or delivered, that sort of thing. So that's always been real good. They've always done an excellent job. Just avail yourself of all the knowledge you possibly can, and don't be put off by the scale of things. Be willing to think big. Be willing to work hard, and it's a very, very gratifying thing. I'll be 66 in January, and I can tell you, doing what I do out here really keeps me young. Keeps me in, my mind sharp, and it keeps my body in shape, and I enjoy it. I just really do.
Love that video of Mr. Stockton, because what he says is so true. There's so much wisdom there as he talks about he likes to be in control, and he knows what his goals are, and he's very involved in the decision making, and understands that, I know that one of the conversations we've had with him is he's understood, like so many landowners, that, I showed the picture of the corn earlier, and, if you mess up, let's say you mess up with a crop of corn, you can do it over that same year, but with trees, it's permanent. It's at least for the next 25 years. So it's so critical to be fully informed on the front end, because when what you plant is going to last for so long. And so it makes a big difference to get it right from the beginning. I do want to mention right quick that we do have a proprietary tool that we use with our partners. This was, I mentioned earlier, or I should have mentioned, I was actually having a discussion earlier with a colleague this morning about standing on the shoulders of giants. And we were talking about some of our old college professors and how we felt like they were the dream team, the all-stars that really understood forestry and Southern forestry in particular. But I also want to mention, we use this information, this calculator that allows a landowner or forester to actually look at their options. And in the background, at the University of Georgia, there were Jerry Clutter was a really big pioneer in growth and yield, and Leon Pinar was also involved in the University of Georgia's Plantation Management Research Cooperative. And I also want to mention, drop the name of Harold Burkhardt, who recently passed, was also a pioneer that gave us such important, or laid the foundation, I should say, for the important information we have, that we're able to use growth and yield models to run simulations like this that are based on real world data from the woods. And those guys really set the stage for what we have today. But this proprietary calculator allows us to use equations from the University of Georgia's Plantation Management Research Co-op and look at genetic options and see not only what the cost of implementing those are, but in the background, the equations that are working, it allows us to derive the growth and yield and the revenue on the back end of the model, so that we can see what the investment is and then what the associated revenue is. So just a few, as we kind of get toward the end here, always remember to order early, not because, I'm not saying that because, like a pitch to say, hey, they're going fast. It's not that it's at all, but it goes back to what Mr. Stockton was saying. Get engaged early is probably what this should say, because it allows you to take your time and understand what your options are and being really comfortable with what you choose to plant on your property. You know, the last thing you want to do is end up with something, you know, like this. I took this picture of a place that had actually been thinned in central South Carolina, really close to the MCP stand I showed you early, where even after thinning, there's still a lot of problems. And this is not what we want in a forest products market that's leaning even heavier to saw timber for lumber. To kind of show you a heat map of what that looks like on the ground, this is a heat map of like an aerial view. This is 1,000 trees. So just think about this as 2 acres, okay, like 500 trees per acre, where the red trees are actually the trees that have defects that can't become saw timber. The yellow trees are actually positions where there was mortality. And so what happens is when you go in there to thin the stand, you've got these big gaps, kind of like I showed you earlier of the landowner in Alabama who ultimately decided to clear cut. The green obviously was saw timber trees, but they're not as evenly spaced as you want them to be. That's the problem. Versus a stand like this in South Central Arkansas, that's MCP, that is very evenly spaced with the trees that you desire, the saw timber or chip saw, in this case, that's becoming saw timber. And so as the statisticians say, you have a lot of degrees of freedom in this stand because you have so many options for growing better products. As you can see, the heat map of the 1,000 trees in this stand looks a lot different. So this landowner is truly optimizing the forest site. And we mentioned, you know, you can't thin your way to heaven. So you can plant fewer trees in a scenario like this too, because you have fewer problem trees. So as I mentioned, you do have choices, you have options. That's what's so beneficial to landowners. I know Steve McKeon says all the time, landowners, Steve actually runs the NC State Tree Improvement Cooperative. And I think he begins every single conference by saying landowners have never had as many options as they have these days. I wanted to show you this picture kind of to kind of broaden the picture here to show you what the stand looks like. I told you I took a picture of a 15-year-old MCP stand right before it was thinned. And then Reforestation advisor Kylie Burdett and I took a picture this past summer after it had been thinned. So that's the same stand. And now it's complete chip and saw timber that's left. And this is really interesting because it's a consulting forester's property who called me and said, and this is wonderful. It's so gratifying when they call you and say, gosh, it feels so good for this to have done exactly what we wanted it to do. I want to introduce our reforestation advisors. They're actually going to enable their microphones for the question and answers in just a few minutes. And their cameras, but I'll introduce them first. Jeffrey Hill is actually our reforestation advisor for Georgia and northern North Carolina and Virginia. Greg Hay, who actually unfortunately couldn't join us today, is our Arkansas reforestation advisor, also has responsibility in southeastern Oklahoma and northern Louisiana. Paul Jeffries, that I mentioned earlier, is actually covers our territory in Mississippi and northern Alabama down to Montgomery. Kylie Burdett, who I just mentioned, is in South Carolina and southern North Carolina. Shannon Stewart, who works with Mr. Stockton, you saw in the video earlier, has responsibility over eastern Texas and southern Louisiana, just up South Louisiana up to Alexandria. And then Jason Cromer manages South Alabama and the Florida Panhandle for us. And so as I mentioned earlier, and they're going to come on for question and answers, and I'll let them field some of those. But just the main takeaway is just remember that know your options and set yourself up for success. Like I mentioned earlier, the forester that manages the land base in East Central Mississippi and West Alabama said, we need our plantations to be built for success. I mean, if we do hit a hot pulpwood market, we want more volume, but we're primarily looking at solid wood markets for the future. That's just where it's going. That's where all the investment is taking place. If you follow the news, and so they, as he said, we need plantations that are built for success and give us more options. So I think at this point, we will move into the question and answer portion of our webinar, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Jason. If you could stop your screen share and
Absolutely.
all right, come on, sign on. One of our first questions is from Randy, and Randy's asking, do you have a reforestation advisor that covers southern middle Tennessee?
Yeah, we sure do. That's actually Paul Jeffries and Jeff Hill kind of split that up at the Mississippi, or I should say the Alabama and Georgia line. So we do have complete coverage over that area. And by the way, for Randy, one thing that we just saw in the news recently was a piece of really good news. They had a ribbon cutting ceremony in Corinth, Mississippi, which is up in Alcorn County, Mississippi, that will be procuring logs out of southern Tennessee. That's really exciting to get that news hot off the press.
Great, thanks, Jason. And just a reminder to anybody who has a question, there's a Q&A option down at the menu of Zoom, and you can feel free to enter your questions there, and we'll get to them one by one. The next question we have here is the following. From a first-year landowner or planter, MCP container. Any opinion as to the value of pre-spraying containers with PGR for quicker establishment and growth?
PGR, I'm not sure I'm familiar, unless that's an enhanced, maybe mycorrhizal stimulant of some sort. I'm not really sure that I've used those yet, though. I would say, I guess I could say this maybe, and I apologize, I'll hand this off to any reforestation advisors if they want to comment, but I would say certainly anything that could potentially enhance growth could help. But one of the things I know, a renowned silviculturist, Lee Allen, said something to me that I'll never forget. This is probably 15 years ago. He said, really good competition control, like woody and herbaceous, grass competition control, can almost act as a fertilizer, because you're putting all of the site's resources and moisture to the seedling. I know I heard Barry Shiver mention earlier, he said a client of his said, gosh, Barry, by the time we get through, we're only going to have pine trees left. And he said, that's exactly what we want. We want to put all the site's resources to the crop trees. And so I'm sure there's fertilizers out there that may be what that is, but good competition control may be the same as a fertilizer in some ways. Just any of the reforestation advisors that want to comment on that, please feel free at this time.
Yep, and just real quick, plant PGR is for plant growth regulators.
Ah, okay. I haven't worked with those personally that much, if at all. Great.
Here's another question here. How many acres have been planted with MCP hybrids and varietals?
Well, we're over, if you think about it, I guess from the, 200 million acres, let's say, of forest land in the US South, and roughly a little over 40 million acres is in plantation pine. And now we're in the probably 2.5 million to 3 million range of MCP and varietals. And the exciting thing for us is a lot of those are now being thinned or have already been thinned with chip and saw coming off of some of those plantings as well.
Great. Next question. This might be a good one for Cromer. What would the advantage be of loblolly versus slash?
Yeah, I'll just be kind of brief on this, but that kind of gets into a little bit of issue on your soil type there. That could be fortunate or unfortunate if you're wanting to get into using some of our loblolly. With our loblolly, we have a lot more genetic options. There's been a lot more improvement in that. So I guess what I would say, if you are looking for some genetic improvement and faster returns on your financial aspects, we'd have to look at what your soil type is and go from there.
Great, thanks so much.
And also, if that didn't answer your question clearly, please feel free to reach out to me and we can dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah, one of the things too with is that with loblolly, I'll just mention really quick too, Cromer, is your loblolly pine is going to be more productive. I mean, you're going to get more volume if it's on the right site. You want to have a clay layer, somewhere at least down in it's nice to have it down in the 2 to 4 foot range if you can. A lot of times slash pine is reserved for your kind of wet sands, if your flatwood sites sometimes that have a little bit more depth of wet sands. And so but I think what you'll find now is a lot of times where people are just kind of saying, we just plant only loblolly in North Florida, or I know a lot of people that Cromer works with, they're like, we've gone from that mindset of growing just slash to realizing that we're 2 or 3 feet down to clay and we could be a lot more productive with loblolly, growing more tons per acre per year, a higher mean annual increment.
Great, thanks, Jason. Here's another question, might be for Mr. Jeffries here. What is the quality of your MCP 15-year-old trees for saw timber? And what can you tell me about wood quality in general if these trees are growing faster?
That's a very good question, and one that we get on a regular basis. Your wood quality and your saw timber is really based on the tree's age and the tree's amount of mature wood versus juvenile wood. So to answer the question and go around a long way is, trees, their first 10 years are putting on more juvenile wood than they are mature wood. So regardless of genetic, MCP open pollinated, they're putting on more of the juvenile wood. And after 10 years, that slows down and the tree starts putting on, or basically starts putting on, more mature wood. Studies have been done, or a study that was done at the University of Georgia found that for the two lumber grade, or the two qualities that are graded for lumber, strength and stiffness, that the plantation wood met and exceeded the 3 grade requirements put forth by the Architectural Design Association. So again, the control pollinated wood that is coming from 15-year-old plantations that's going into chip and saw is going in to produce your 2x4s. The wood quality is going to be there. The specific gravity is going to be there, and it's going to meet the demand or the grades that are put forth by the architectural community.
Awesome, thanks, Paul. Next question here from Jeff is, can you give us a brief rundown of the various seedling types and the characteristics of each genetic improvement level, pollination method, etc.? Kind of an overview of the portfolio of the seedlings that Arborgen produces.
I I'd be happy to. I could probably pass that to one of the other reforestation advisors. Jeff, would you like to take that one perhaps, or? Jeff, not that Jeff answered the question, but Jeff Hill.
I think you're muted, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Great. Yeah, kind of simplistically, we have open pollinated, mass control pollinated varietal seedlings in both bare root and containerized forms. And we have different categories within the open pollinated and MCP categories. So we begin at advanced, and then the middle grade would be select, and then the elite grade would be the top grade in both OP and MCP. And also we have now a 2.0 grade, which is the highest grade. It's fairly new that's available to our clients in the MCP. So we're really excited about it. And also we differentiate coastal plain from Piedmont selections depending on your location. So you have a lot of different options, and yeah, it really is kind of confusing. We look at them all from afar, but that's our job. That's what we do with our clients, is to present those options where they'll be practical for them on their land.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeffrey.
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the hardwoods that Arborgen produces, and what kind of cases those are best for?
Oh, yeah. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, Christopher.
Sure. The question is what is the hardwood portfolio like in terms of what Arborgen produces?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question for Dr. Jeffries.
So our hardwood production covers a large gamut of applications. We produce all of the major oak species. We also produce species for wetland mitigation, mine reclamation. So we have several species across our portfolio. With the oaks, we do the cherry bark, white, swamp chestnut, water willow, nuttall, shumard, and several others. We also do sweet gum, sycamore, and yellow poplar for what is used as trainer trees, and then other species for such as water tupelo, water hickory for wetland areas.
Thanks, Paul. Another question here. Are there any issues with deer predation? Let me reread this. Are there any issues with deer predation increases using containerized seedlings, especially with early plantings?
Well, Kylie, would you like to take this one for us if you've seen anything from your experience with this?
I know this past year, Jason and I, we both saw that in a containerized longleaf stand that was actually planted later in the season. So I really haven't seen any correlation between early and later plantings with deer predation on that. Paul, have you seen anything like that in your area with the earlier plantings?
Not with the earlier planting, not the timing of the planting. Sometimes we have seen some issues with deer predation, regardless of what time it has been. And surprisingly, it has been correlated with the amount of herbaceous control on the site with site prep spray. I have actually visited tracts that had they had done a tremendous job with controlling the competing vegetation with their site prep spray, and in essence, the deer had targeted some of the planted seedlings simply because there was nothing left. There was no browse left on the site for them to eat. It can be an issue, especially if you're in an area where there are high deer densities. Typically, if the property is leased for hunting, or if the hunting is taking place on it, getting with your local state wildlife department, they will come out and can do a survey of your deer population, and it can recommend whether you need to take more or fewer deer. So there's a lot of things that factor into that. But yes, that can happen.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, some really great questions. There are two that are very closely related, so I'm going to combine them. What are the primary differences and purposes of the various lines of pine seedlings? For example, what's the difference between varietals and MCP? What's the difference between MCP and MCP Elite?
Well, that's a good, I'll take a stab at that one, because it's true, kind of like what Jeff said earlier, Jeffrey Hill, from afar, it can look really difficult, but that's why we're here, to try to do our best to explain it. But so remember, there's just three types of loblolly pine seedlings: open pollinated, where we know the mother, we don't know the father; MCP, where we know both the mother and the father, so we have a lot better control on the genetic outcome, genetic certainty, and thus the development of the stand, productivity, and all those things that go along with it. But then with varietals, we're going one step further. We're taking just one, an MCP cone that we go and harvest off a tree may have 80 seeds in the cone, 100 seeds, whatever it has. And we will take one seed, I'm making this much more simplistic than it actually is in the whole process of having to vegetatively propagate, the propagules and do all that work. But it's basically, a varietal is just one seed that you have thoroughly tested for 6 years, 7 years. And then you've made millions of copies of that one seed. So that's the difference, the primary differences. Now, let me jump back for just a second and mention that sometimes we get asked, why do you have different MCP categories? And the reason is because there's still dramatic differences in the genetic gain or potential among MCP families. The way that we categorize MCP is they all can have the same quality trait potential. So I'm talking about like disease resistance, straightness, or form, like the slide we showed you earlier that was up the stem. We want every tree to look like that if we can. And less forking also is very important. But so the quality potential is all the same among those MCP categories, MCP advanced or select or elite, and now our new category, MCP 2.0. But the big difference, the distinction, is the growth or the productivity. And so that's the chief differences. And it may sound complicated right now, but it's our reforestation advisors. When I first started doing this, it was just people ordered green trees. It's much different now. Just like Mr. Stockton in the video, they get involved in the process. A lot of landowners who are engaged get involved in the process, and you can look at these things on paper, and within 5 minutes, it's easy to make a decision because you can look at data that I've just described.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jason. Couple more questions. Actually, they keep coming in. What is the best way to control fusiform rust once the new saplings are in the ground?
Well, I don't, by that
I'll take
time,
that one.
yeah, go ahead. I was going to say somebody is probably going to go where I was going, but go ahead, Paul.
So fusiform rust is a fungus, or it as it's getting established on the tree, it is done by spore. But the resistance to fusiform rust is very, very well controlled by genetics. So we have genetic families that are 70, 80, 90% resistant to fusiform rust. So there's really not anything to do post-planting to control the rust if you have a family that is resistant to it. There's not an application of a fungicide that you need to put. It's just you need to pick the right family. If you are in a high rust occurrence area, and the U.S. Forest Service puts out a heat map that shows those areas that have high rust occurrence. And if your property is in one of those areas, it's very, very advisable for you to pick a family that has a high genetic resistance to that rust.
Because once they're in the ground, it can be too late. That was the picture we showed earlier, that the person had not been actively engaged in the process, planted the trees, and they all look the same, in their seedlings, but there's vast genetic differences. But it can be too late when they're already in the ground. There's really nothing you can do to prevent it by that time.
And the rust can vary from year to year, from spring to spring. You can have a situation where you got really a high rust situation one year and then not much 2 years later. So that's pretty variable. So yeah, like these guys are saying, really look at the rust resistant scores on your PRS scores for your family or your cross.
That's a great point, Jeff.
Great. Another question is kind of a follow-up to the different classifications of the pine seedlings. Are all elite seedlings the same? Like, for example, are elite seedlings from one supplier the same as elite seedlings from another supplier? Are they the same as the elite seedlings from Arborgen?
Would somebody like to take that?
Farmer, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can. The short answer is no. There's stuff that we have in our program that others don't have. And I won't get into details of that, but I'll give a kind of simple answer on maybe why. Because I don't want to simply say that, hey, yes, we have something different. With anything, we came from companies that had been doing this a while in the 70s and so on. And so the selections had been taking place for quite a while. And so it'd be like us, I'll use this example and analogy, but let's start a dog breeding program and we start a hunting line. We may have dogs that are really refined and we know that they're going to be great dogs for whatever we may want to do. But so somebody sees, hey, I want to come in and I want to do that too. Well, our line and our pedigree may be farther down the road simply because we've been doing it longer. It doesn't mean that other companies don't have great products by any means. But that's just simply the nature of the business. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Right.
Also, I'd like to add on too. Also, there's a way of switching names around that can cause more confusion. And when, what we call elite, someone else may call by another name. And it's always advisable to go by those PRS scores when you ask. Make sure that those families have been tested in your area and look at those scores when you're picking the family that you need, because there's what's the saying, there's a lot in the name. It can get confusing.
It's also probably a good time. It's also probably a good time to mention that generation doesn't really matter. I know that Kylie was working with somebody recently that was talking about third or fourth generation seedlings, but that's something very important to remember, is that generation doesn't really matter anymore. That's why we use terms like elite. It can be a first generation tree and be elite. That was discovered and selected in the 1950s, or it could have been selected as a third cycle forward selection and be elite, or it could be a third cycle and be not even used anymore. So it's kind of like just remember, just the age doesn't matter. We don't go by generation anymore. It's all about performance of whatever the age is of the tree.
And I wanted to add too, if I can, on both the things like what Paul and Watson touched on there, and I'll use our OP program for an example as refining that pedigree. So the elite in the OP program has to be the top 3%. So as stuff is improved, it may bump something down a category that's still a great tree. So as Paul recommended to get the PRS sheets on the performance, do so. Talk to your reforestation advisor on what's out there, because there's a chance that there's a really good tree out there that's an OP select for us, and it's nothing wrong with it. We just had something come in that may be at a 2.8%, or just outside of I've said that backwards, but it may be like in the top 4%, not quite inside the top 3% in the program. And it's a fine tree, and you're going to get it at a better price if that's something that is important to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Cromer. That was helpful. And for people who don't know what PRS sheets are, can somebody tell us what those are for people who are not aware of those?
Kylie, could you volunteer that for our guest?
Yeah, sure thing. So there are performance review sheets, and it also stands for productivity, rust, and straightness. And they are produced by the NC State Co-op. And there are basically, it's the family that you want to plant, and it is checked against a check lot in your state or the area that you're planting. So you know how the seedling is going to perform against the wild or natural stand that would originally be in that area. So it allows you to see the volume gain that you would have over, just a natural pine out there. Jason, is that about it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kylie. We have a few more questions here. Are solid wood users becoming more receptive to fast-growing trees, or will we need to run out of natural stands before they readily accept fast-growing plantation wood?
So that varies a lot with the mill and their wood drain and the weather. Certainly if somebody's used to a 50-year-old saw log scenario and they get 6 months of wet weather, then they'll start thinking about plantation wood. But the real deal is about stem quality. You can meet the specs, but knot size, internode branch, length between branches, all that's really important. And so what we're looking at, especially with our MCP program, varietal program, is quality of the stem. Flat branching angles with small branch size, long internode lengths between branch whorls, low propensity fork, good rust resistance. So that's a real important thing to think about. So we're doing, right now, you're getting some small chip and saw off first thinnings on MCP on a lot of stands. And, by the time you get to a second thin, you've got a real high percentage of chip and saw material head towards saw timber. And then ultimately, we'd like to grow poles as well, for our clients. So all this is taken consideration in our tree improvement program as we advance our genetics.
And I think, to build on what Jeff said, I think one thing to keep in mind too is that I know I've listened, Marshall Thomas, who's the president of F&W Forestry, he presented at the Mississippi Forestry Association annual meeting last year in 2021. And as a survey they did as a company with their contract loggers for their clients, with the contract loggers, that over 85% of the wood they harvest is plantation wood. And, so that's changed a lot over the years. But the thing that, remember, I think this is really important to remember, is that, companies are and have been for a long time sawing plantation wood, and the techniques they use in kiln drying Because one of the things I don't think they were, and there's people who have forgotten a lot more than I'll ever know about this, and maybe some experts on the webinar, but one of the things too that they've kind of perfected is to lower the heat in kilns and then also dry slower. I had a guy tell me one time, it's like, ribs, it's like slow and low. And that's how they get better, better results in the lumber quality. So from that, but it doesn't matter what kind of tree it is. If you cut it before a loblolly pine before age 20, it's going to be 70% moisture. So, we're not telling nobody, I don't think in the industry is saying going out and cut, 18-year-old logs unless the sawmill just wants them for some reason. This is really more about producing like more quality stems per acre, with less, stem sweep too, because that hurts wood quality. Stem sweep actually produces more compression wood and tension wood and causes problems with boards. And so the straighter the stem, the better the wood quality.
Perfect, thank you. And we have about 7 more questions, if you all are okay sticking on for a few more questions here. The next one is this. Have you seen any issues with butt sweep in 14-year-old MCP Select bare root?
I have to say no, not in my experience, but somebody else may be able to chime in on that.
And see it.
I haven't seen anything. It's very specific,
Yeah.
but I haven't seen anything.
The only thing I could think of would be if that could happen is in and what age again, Christopher? I'm sorry.
14.
The only thing I could think of that may could happen is if there was a significant wind event, because I have seen ice or wind cause some, visual damage, but it's a big wind event normally that could maybe cause something like that. Outside of that, from a genetic, by then the trees have been, tested before they ever go to the field in repetitive geographies or wide physiographic ranges. So we'd have seen it before it goes to the field.
Great, thank you. Next question. Are containers more forgiving than machine plant or bare root? How can we best protect ourselves from machine planter error?
I would say stay with the machine planter, stay with the planter and supervise. I do not think that containerized, machine planted containerized adds anything extra to just machine planted bare root. The best thing about machine planting is the depth at which it plants the seedling and the tightness at which as how it closes the hole. The perfectly planted loblolly pine has got about 3 inches sticking out of the ground. You cannot plant them too deep unless you just completely bury them, because the deeper you get the bare root seedling, the closer to the water table, the less likely it is for the area of the soil, if you have a droughty spring and summer, to dry out, because it's going to be that much deeper. Again, I don't think going to a containerized or machine planting gets you any extra insurance.
Thanks, Paul. Next question. Have you done any studies comparing the green weight of fast growing varietals versus standard trees?
The weight. I'm trying to think. We're members of the University of Georgia Wood Quality Consortium, and we could, if the person who asked the question would like to maybe give us their email, and we could look at that certainly. But it's probably one thing that could probably inform us there is that, remember the specific gravity is a really good proxy for weight. That's obviously has a lot to do with density too. So one of the things that was found a long time ago was that there's not a correlation between growth and specific gravity, wood specific gravity density. You can, if you look at a scatter plot, a scattergram, for instance, you would see that there's a lot of slow growing trees that have really low wood density, believe it or not. And then a lot of fast growing trees that have really high wood density. So there's a genetic component to that. It's not as clear cut as, you know, when we say fast, I think people think fast growing trees. We've shown you pictures of tall trees, but remember, that's not just apples to apples. As I've mentioned, it's still governed by the age, as Paul Jeffries said earlier. So a lot of it has to do with the genetic component of wood specific gravity.
And to
Great.
take that a step further, as far as demand goes, a lot of the new mills in the state of Mississippi, we have a lot of new mills coming in or have already established, as Jason mentioned earlier, the one in Corinth. I have personal relationships with procurement foresters from 2 of the new mills, and I have directly asked the question of age requirement, ring requirement, and none of the ones I've asked, none of them are going to have any minimum age, minimum ring per inch. Plantation or natural wood does not matter. They do not have any requirements like those for the round wood they're going to be buying for those mills.
And keep in mind too, if you're a landowner that, and a buyer, was to potentially say, well, we want longer rotations, that's okay too. But remember, it would be nice to know if you're going to get paid more for carrying those rotations longer. That's a component of it. And there's a really good article called, if you Google good wood, it's pretty easy to remember, Good Wood by Steve McKeon and Tom Byram and JB Jett. That's a really good read. It talks about everything we're discussing right now.
Right. And let's face it again, if I'm going to invest just to get an older stand, if I'm going to invest 50 years, hypothetically, 50 years to grow a stand of timber, I would whole lot rather have a 50-year-old stand of straight, non-forked, disease-free stems than have a 50-year-old stand of twisted, forked, because you're investing the same amount of time. You're investing the 50 years, or ever how long your management plan, your rotation length, ever how long it is, you're investing the same amount of time, but you can vary the genetic that you plant. And it is imperative that you make that correct decision at the beginning.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. A few more questions. Does Arborgen plan to develop lines of shortleaf pine seedlings for those who prefer to plant more native species in their particular areas?
Somebody like to take that?
Well, go ahead, Jeff. You're more in shortleaf territory.
I'd say it's all about demand. Right now we've just got a few folks that, have got cost share programs through some states that want to plant shortleaf, but it's a really, really small amount. So if we see the demand increase and people ask for improved genetics, then, that would prompt us.
I'd also add that, the shortleaf is the new kid on the block. It's the one that the shortleaf initiative has just started, and it's getting a lot of attention as compared to the longleaf initiative, which has been around for a little while now, several years, and it's getting a lot of attention. And it has, NC State just, I believe this year, or it might have been 21, has started up the longleaf tree improvement co-op. So is all based on demand. It is all based on interest. And yeah, I think if the short leaf demand stays around like the long leaf has, then you may see something in the next coming years.
Thanks, Paul. I think we have time. And thanks, Jeffrey. I think we have time for just one more. Appreciate you all sticking around with answering all these questions. Is there any info that shows correlation with better genetics and fewer pine beetles?
I think
No,
the short answer is no.
no.
It's so forest health dependent, probably more so than anything. You know, making sure you're doing your thinnings on time. You know, good genetics certainly could. I will say this. I mean, better genetics probably make for better forest health because you've got less disease. You always want, you know, fewer trees that are stressed in your stand, whether that be from the genetics, health, or stand density management, you know, thinning at the right time. So you're not caught in a drought with a really dense stand and have either widespread mortality or either sporadic mortality. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today.